Maya Chen was 29 years old when she received the text message that would make her question everything she thought she knew about her sister. The message arrived on a rainy Thursday morning while she sat in her favorite corner booth at Riverside Café, steam rising from her lavender latte as she reviewed lesson plans for her high school literature classes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The text was from Victoria, her older sister by 3 years, and it was unlike anything Victoria had ever sent before. Instead of the usual dismissive comments about Maya's single status or unsolicited advice about her career choices, the message was desperate, vulnerable, and completely unexpected. Maya, I need your help. Everything is falling apart with Marcus, and I don't know what to do. You always seem so happy and content on your own. How do you do it? Can we talk? Maya stared at the screen, her coffee growing cold as she reread the words. Victoria, who had spent years telling Maya she'd never find happiness because she was too picky, too independent, too focused on her career instead of finding a husband, was now asking for relationship advice. The same Victoria who had smugly announced 3 engagements before finally marrying Marcus 2 years ago in an elaborate ceremony that their parents had remortgaged their house to afford. The irony wasn't lost on Maya as she set down her phone and gazed out the rain-streaked window. Growing up in the small coastal town of Millbrook, Washington, Maya had always been the odd one out in the Chen family. While Victoria collected boyfriends like trophies and changed her life plans based on whoever she was dating, Maya had charted her own course with quiet determination. Their childhood home sat on Maple Street, a modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch where their mother, Linda, grew prize-winning roses. Their father, David, worked as the town's only veterinarian, while Linda managed the local library's children's program. The family wasn't wealthy, but they were comfortable, respected members of the tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Victoria had been the golden child from day one. With her striking features inherited from their Chinese grandmother and their mother's auburn hair, she turned heads wherever she went. She was homecoming queen, student body president, and dated the captain of the football team. Teachers loved her charm, parents approved of her ambition to become a doctor, and boys lined up for the privilege of taking her to school dances. Maya, meanwhile, preferred books to boys and spent her weekends at the animal shelter rather than shopping malls. She was quieter, more introspective. With straight black hair she kept in the simple ponytail and a preference for comfort over fashion. While Victoria planned elaborate Sweet 16 parties, Maya celebrated her birthday with a small gathering of close friends and a homemade cake. The differences between the sisters became more pronounced as they entered their 20s. Victoria breezed through college on a combination of scholarships and parental support, changing her major 3 times before settling on communications. She graduated with decent grades and immediately moved to Seattle, determined to climb the corporate ladder while simultaneously hunting for Mr. Right. Maya chose the State University 40 minutes from home, earning a degree in English literature with a minor in creative writing. She paid her own way through school with a combination of part-time jobs, scholarships she researched herself, and student loans she was determined to pay off as quickly as possible. After graduation, she returned to Millbrook to teach at the high school she'd once attended, finding deep satisfaction in nurturing young minds and helping students discover their love of literature. The family dynamic became increasingly strained as the years passed. Every holiday gathering, every family barbecue, every casual Sunday dinner became an opportunity for Victoria to highlight Maya's single status. The comments started as gentle teasing, but gradually sharpened into cutting observations disguised as sisterly concern. "Maya, you can't be alone forever," Victoria would say, usually after announcing her latest romantic conquest. "You're already 25. Don't you want to get married and have children like normal people?" When Maya explained that she was focusing on building her career and hadn't met the right person, Victoria would shake her head with exaggerated sympathy. "You're too picky. That's your problem. You can't expect Prince Charming to just show up in Millbrook. You need to put yourself out there. Lower your standards a little." The suggestions always followed the same pattern. Victoria would recommend online dating apps, blind dates with her friends' brothers, or moving to a bigger city where the dating pool was larger. She seemed genuinely convinced that Maya's contentment was a facade hiding deep loneliness and desperation. "I worry about you," Victoria had said during last year's Christmas dinner, her voice carrying across the dining room where their extended family sat listening. "You seem happy now, but what happens in 10 years when all your friends are married with families? You'll be that spinster teacher living alone with cats. Is that really the life you want?" Maya had learned to deflect these comments with humor or redirect the conversation, but they stung nonetheless, not because she doubted her choices, but because her own sister couldn't see her as complete or successful without a romantic relationship. Victoria measured worth by relationship status, and by that metric, Maya would always fall short. The pattern continued when Victoria met Marcus Richardson at a corporate networking event in Seattle. Marcus was everything Victoria thought she wanted: tall, handsome, successful in commercial real estate, and eager to settle down with the right woman. Their courtship was a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and social media posts documenting every romantic gesture. Within 6 months, Victoria was planning their wedding and couldn't resist sharing her superior wisdom with Maya. "See how easy it is when you're open to love?" she would say during their weekly phone calls. "Marcus and I just clicked because we both knew what we wanted. You could have this too if you stop being so stubborn about your impossible standards." The wedding was everything Victoria had dreamed of: a beachfront ceremony with 200 guests, designer dress, professional photographer, and a reception that lasted till midnight.
Maya served as maid of honor, smiling through the speeches where Victoria credited Marcus with completing her and making her whole. During the reception, Victoria had pulled Maya aside between the bouquet toss and cake cutting. "I hope seeing how happy Marcus and I are will inspire you to take some risks," she'd said, her wedding dress rustling as she gestured toward the dance floor where couples swayed to romantic music. "This is what real happiness looks like, Maya. Don't you want this for yourself?" Maya had congratulated her sister sincerely, but privately wondered if Victoria's happiness was as complete as she claimed. There had been moments during the engagement when Victoria seemed anxious rather than excited, when she complained about Marcus's long work hours or his assumption that she would handle all the wedding planning while he focused on his career. After the wedding, Victoria and Marcus settled into married life in their expensive downtown Seattle apartment. Victoria took a position at a marketing firm, while Marcus expanded his real estate portfolio. From the outside, they appeared to have everything: successful careers, beautiful home, active social life, and plans for starting a family within a few years. But the cracks began showing during holiday visits. Marcus would spend most of his time on his phone, fielding calls from clients and colleagues. Victoria would make excuses for his behavior while clearly feeling ignored and unimportant. The romantic gestures that had characterized their courtship disappeared, replaced by practical discussions about mortgage payments and career advancement. Maya noticed the changes but kept her observations to herself. Victoria had made it clear that Maya's single status disqualified her from offering relationship advice. Besides, Maya had learned that Victoria rarely wanted honest feedback, preferring validation of her choices over challenging conversations. The dynamic reached its peak 6 months before the text message that would change everything. During a family barbecue at their parents' house, Victoria had launched into another lecture about Maya's romantic life, this time in front of their cousins and family friends. "Maya's problem is she thinks she's too good for the men in Millbrook," Victoria announced as they sat around the patio table laden with their father's famous grilled salmon. "She has these impossibly high standards and refuses to compromise. Meanwhile, the biological clock is ticking and she's wasting her best years being alone." Maya had felt the familiar heat of embarrassment and frustration, but this time something snapped. Instead of deflecting with humor or changing the subject, she set down her fork and looked directly at her sister. "Victoria, I'm happy with my life. I have a career I love, friends who support me, hobbies that fulfill me, and a sense of purpose that doesn't depend on someone else's validation. Why is that so hard for you to accept?" The table had gone quiet, sensing the shift from casual teasing to serious confrontation. Victoria's face flushed as she realized the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. "I'm just trying to help you," Victoria replied, her voice defensive. I've been where you are and I know how lonely it can be. Marcus and I want to see you happy. But I am happy, Maya had insisted, her voice steady despite the attention from their relatives. Just because my happiness doesn't look like yours doesn't make it less valid. I'm not settling for someone who doesn't appreciate me just because society says I should be paired off by 30. Victoria had laughed, but there was an edge to it. Easy to say when you haven't found anyone willing to put up with your standards. But sure, keep telling yourself you're happy alone. We'll see how you feel in a few years when everyone else has moved on with their lives. The conversation had ended there, but the tension lingered through the rest of the gathering. Maya left that evening more determined than ever to prove that happiness came in many forms, and romantic partnership was just one option among many. Over the following months, Maya threw herself into activities that brought her joy and fulfillment. She started a book club at the library that grew from 5 members to 25. She volunteered at the animal shelter, eventually fostering 3 rescue cats who filled her small apartment with warmth and companionship. She took up hiking and discovered a love for photography, documenting the natural beauty of the Pacific Northwest coast. Her teaching career flourished as well. She developed innovative curriculum that helped struggling students connect with classic literature, started an after-school creative writing program, and mentored several students who went on to win regional writing competitions. Her principal recognized her contributions with the Teacher of the Year award, and she was invited to present her teaching methods at the State Education Conference. Maya also cultivated meaningful friendships with colleagues and community members who shared her interests and values. Her social calendar was full of dinner parties, hiking trips, cultural events, and quiet evenings with friends who appreciated her for exactly who she was. She discovered that being single didn't mean being alone, and that romantic love, while wonderful, wasn't the only path to a fulfilling life. The transformation wasn't just external. Maya developed a confidence and self-assurance that radiated from within. She stopped second-guessing her choices or apologizing for her priorities. When well-meaning friends or family members suggested she should be more open to dating, she responded with gentle humor and unwavering certainty about her own worth. During this period of personal growth, Victoria's marriage began showing more obvious signs of strain. Her social media posts became less frequent and more generic. When she did visit Millbrook, she seemed tired and stressed, though she maintained the facade that everything was perfect with Marcus. Maya began noticing small details that painted a different picture. She would check her phone constantly during family gatherings, her face falling when Marcus didn't respond to her messages. She made excuses for his absence from events, claiming work obligations that seemed to multiply as time went on. The romantic gestures that had characterized their courtship disappeared, replaced by practical discussions about mortgage payments and career advancement.
As Maya's confidence and contentment became more apparent, Victoria's comments became sharper and more frequent. It was as if seeing Maya thrive independently threatened the narrative Victoria had constructed about marriage being the ultimate source of happiness. "You're just putting on a brave face," Victoria said during one particularly tense phone conversation. "I know you must be lonely rattling around that apartment by yourself. Don't you ever want someone to share your life with? Someone to take care of you when you're sick or celebrate your successes?" Maya had patiently explained that she had plenty of people who cared about her and celebrated her achievements. Her book club friends, teaching colleagues, and neighbors formed a supportive community that enriched her daily life in countless ways. But Victoria seemed unable to understand that meaningful relationships extended beyond romantic partnerships. The pattern continued for months, with Victoria alternating between pitying Maya's single status and defending her own marriage against observations no one was making. Maya began to suspect that Victoria's insistence on the superiority of married life was as much about convincing herself as anyone else. The breaking point came when Victoria called Maya late on a Tuesday night, her voice thick with tears she was trying to hide. Marcus had forgotten their second wedding anniversary, she explained, then tried to make up for it by having his assistant send flowers to her office 3 days later. When Victoria confronted him about the lack of thoughtfulness, he'd accused her of being needy and unrealistic about his availability. But that's just how men are, Victoria had insisted, even as her voice broke. They're not naturally romantic like women. I shouldn't expect him to remember every little detail when he's working so hard to provide for our future. Maya had listened with growing concern, recognizing the rationalization and excuse-making that characterized many troubled relationships. But when she gently suggested that Victoria deserved a partner who made their anniversary a priority, Victoria had snapped back with familiar venom. Easy for you to judge when you've never had to maintain a real relationship, Victoria said. Marriage is work, Maya. It requires compromise and understanding. You wouldn't know about that because you've never had to put anyone else's needs before your own. The accusation had stung because it was so fundamentally unfair. Maya put others' needs first constantly in her role as a teacher, her volunteer work, and her friendships. She just didn't believe that meant accepting poor treatment from a romantic partner. But Victoria seemed determined to frame Maya's standards as selfishness rather than self-respect. That conversation had taken place 6 weeks before the desperate text message that now glowed on Maya's phone screen. As Maya sat in the cafe processing Victoria's request for help, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of role reversal. The rain had stopped while Maya was lost in thought, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the cafe windows, casting everything in warm golden light. She reread Victoria's message, noting the vulnerability and desperation that replaced the usual condescension. Something significant had happened to crack Victoria's facade of marital bliss, and she was finally admitting what Maya had suspected for months. Maya finished her coffee and gathered her things, her mind already working through how to respond to her sister's unprecedented request. Part of her felt vindicated that Victoria was finally acknowledging Maya's emotional wisdom and stability, but a larger part felt genuine concern for her sister, who seemed to be discovering that the perfect marriage she'd constructed in her mind didn't match the reality of her daily life. As Maya walked to her car, she thought about the conversation that lay ahead. Victoria had spent years dismissing Maya's choices and insisting that romantic partnership was the only path to true happiness. Now she was reaching out to the sister she'd pitied, asking for guidance from someone she considered fundamentally incomplete. The irony was profound, but Maya felt no desire to gloat or deliver cutting observations about Victoria's reversal. Instead, she felt the familiar protective instinct she'd always had for her older sister, even during their most difficult moments. Victoria was struggling, and despite years of thoughtless comments and dismissive treatment, Maya wanted to help. She drove home to her cozy apartment where her rescue cats greeted her with purring and head bumps. The space reflected her personality perfectly, filled with books, art from local artists, plants thriving in every window, and photographs from her hiking adventures. It was a home that felt complete and welcoming, a refuge that reflected her values and interests. Maya settled in her reading chair, a cup of herbal tea steaming on the side table, and composed her response to Victoria's message. She chose her words carefully, balancing compassion with honesty, offering support without judgment. I'm here for you, Victoria. Let's talk tonight after I finish grading papers. Whatever's happening, we'll figure it out together. She sent the message, and then sat back, wondering what revelations the conversation would bring. Victoria's marriage was clearly in trouble, but Maya suspected the real crisis went deeper than relationship problems. Victoria was being forced to confront the possibility that she'd built her identity around someone else's validation, and that foundation was proving less stable than she believed. The phone rang an hour later, just as Maya was finishing her stack of student essays. Victoria's voice was thick with exhaustion and something that sounded like defeat. Maya, I don't know how you do it. How do you seem so content all the time? How do you not feel like you're missing something essential? The question was so different from Victoria's usual approach that Maya took a moment to gather her thoughts. This wasn't about defending her lifestyle or correcting misconceptions. This was her sister reaching out from a place of genuine confusion and pain. Tell me what's happening with Marcus, Maya said gently, settling deeper into her chair as she prepared to listen. The story that emerged over the next hour painted a picture of a marriage that had been struggling almost from the beginning. Marcus worked 60-hour weeks and spent most of his free time either recovering from work stress or socializing with clients.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Victoria had gradually realized that she was essentially living alone while maintaining the appearance of a partnership. He comes home exhausted and just wants to watch television or go to bed, Victoria explained, her voice barely above a whisper. We haven't had a real conversation in weeks. When I try to talk about how I'm feeling or what I need from our relationship, he says I'm being dramatic or needy. I feel like I'm disappearing. Maya listened with growing understanding and sympathy. Victoria had discovered what Maya had long suspected, that being in the wrong relationship was far lonelier than being single. The validation Victoria had sought through marriage hadn't materialized because Marcus was too self-absorbed to provide the emotional connection she craved. I keep thinking about how happy you seem, Victoria continued. You have your teaching, your book club, your hiking group, your volunteer work. You seem fulfilled in ways I don't feel, even though I have everything I thought I wanted. The admission was difficult for Victoria to voice, Maya could tell. She'd spent years defining herself in opposition to Maya's choices, and now she was questioning the very foundations of her identity and decision-making. Victoria, happiness isn't one size fits all, Maya said carefully. What works for me might not work for you, and vice versa. But I think the key is being honest about what actually fulfills you versus what you think should fulfill you. They talked for another hour, with Victoria gradually opening up about the loneliness and disappointment that had characterized much of her marriage. She'd been trying so hard to make her relationship match her expectations that she'd ignored clear signs of incompatibility and emotional neglect. I used to judge you for being single, Victoria admitted near the end of their conversation. I thought you were just scared or too picky. But now I think maybe you were just smarter than I was. You knew what you needed to be happy, and you didn't settle for less. The acknowledgement was significant, but Maya sensed it was just the beginning of Victoria's journey toward self-awareness. Her sister had built her adult identity around being the one who had it all figured out, the one who'd found the secret to happiness that Maya was missing. Dismantling that narrative would take time and courage. Over the following weeks, Maya and Victoria talked regularly as Victoria began confronting the reality of her marriage. Marcus was resistant to couples counseling, dismissive of Victoria's concerns, and unwilling to make changes to accommodate her emotional needs. Victoria began to understand that she'd fallen in love with Marcus's potential rather than accepting who he actually was. The conversations weren't always easy. Victoria still occasionally slipped into old patterns of defensiveness or attempts to minimize the problems in her marriage. But gradually, she began acknowledging what Maya had seen from the beginning, that Victoria had been trying to force her relationship to provide something it wasn't capable of delivering. I think I convinced myself that being married would make me complete, but I'm realizing that I wasn't complete on my own first. I was looking for Marcus to fill gaps that I should have addressed myself. Maya recognized this as a breakthrough moment. Victoria was beginning to understand that romantic relationships could enhance an already fulfilling life, but couldn't create fulfillment from nothing. The happiness Maya had found came from building a rich, meaningful existence based on her own values and interests, not from external validation. As winter turned to spring, Victoria made the difficult decision to separate from Marcus and file for divorce. It wasn't an easy choice, and it required confronting the judgment of family members and friends who'd seen her marriage as proof of her success. But Victoria was finally prioritizing her authentic needs over the appearance of having it all together. I'm terrified, Victoria admitted as she prepared to move out of the downtown apartment she'd shared with Marcus. I haven't been single since college. I don't know how to be alone without feeling like I'm failing at life.
Maya offered practical support, helping Victoria find a smaller apartment closer to her job and providing emotional encouragement during the most difficult moments of the separation process. But more importantly, she helped Victoria begin to see solitude as an opportunity rather than a punishment. Being alone isn't the same as being lonely, Maya explained as they painted Victoria's new bedroom a soft yellow that reflected her personality rather than matching someone else's preferences. When you're comfortable with yourself, spending time alone becomes restorative rather than depressing. Victoria was skeptical at first, but as she settled into her new life, she began discovering aspects of herself that had been dormant during her marriage. She joined a pottery class and found unexpected joy in creating beautiful objects with her hands. She reconnected with old friends she'd neglected while focusing on her relationship with Marcus. She started taking long walks on weekend mornings, using the time to think and plan rather than feeling anxious about filling every moment with activity. The transformation wasn't immediate or linear. Victoria still occasionally had moments of doubt and loneliness, times when she questioned whether she'd made the right choice in leaving Marcus. But Maya was there to listen and remind her that growth often felt uncomfortable before it felt empowering. "I keep thinking about how happy you seem," Victoria said during one particularly meaningful conversation.
But I think I was the one who was missing out. I was so focused on checking off relationship milestones that I never took time to figure out what I actually enjoyed or valued. The role reversal was complete, but it didn't feel like victory to Maya. Instead, it felt like her sister was finally discovering truths that Maya had hoped she'd recognize years earlier. Victoria was learning that happiness came from authenticity, self-awareness, and the courage to build a life based on personal values rather than external expectations. The most significant moment came 6 months after Victoria's divorce was finalized. Maya was preparing dinner in her apartment when Victoria called with excitement in her voice for the first time in years. "Maya, I have to tell you something," Victoria said, practically bubbling with enthusiasm. "I had the most amazing day. I went to the farmer's market this morning, then worked in my pottery studio all afternoon. This evening, I'm going to a book reading downtown with some friends from my class, and I realized that I felt completely happy and fulfilled without needing anyone else to validate my choices." Maya felt tears of joy spring to her eyes as she listened to her sister's revelation. This was what she'd always hoped Victoria would discover. That contentment came from within, from building a life that reflected personal values and interests rather than societal expectations. "That's wonderful, Victoria," Maya said warmly. "You sound more like yourself than you have in years." "I feel like myself," Victoria replied, "and I owe you an apology, Maya, a big one. I spent years trying to convince you that you were incomplete without a romantic relationship, but you were actually modeling exactly what I needed to learn. You showed me that it's possible to be whole on your own, to build happiness from your own interests and values, rather than depending on someone else to provide it." The apology was meaningful, but Maya was most happy to hear the joy and self-assurance in her sister's voice. Victoria had finally discovered what Maya had tried to tell her for years, that happiness wasn't a one-size-fits-all formula, and that the most important relationship anyone could cultivate was the one with themselves. "I'm proud of you for having the courage to start over," Maya said sincerely. "It couldn't have been easy to walk away from something you'd invested so much in." "It wasn't," Victoria agreed, "but staying would have been harder. I was trying so hard to make Marcus love me the way I needed to be loved that I forgot to love myself that way first." As they ended their conversation, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Victoria's crisis had ultimately become a catalyst for growth and self-discovery. The sister who had once pitied Maya's single status now sought her guidance on building an independent, fulfilling life. The transformation extended to their family dynamics as well. Their parents, who had once worried about Maya's unmarried status, began to see that both daughters were capable of creating happiness in different ways. Victoria's divorce had been difficult for them to accept initially, but seeing her renewed confidence and joy helped them understand that marriage wasn't automatically superior to singlehood. During their next family gathering, Maya noticed that the conversation flowed differently. Victoria no longer felt the need to defend her choices or compare her life to others.
She spoke enthusiastically about her pottery, her new friendships, and her plans for the future without reference to romantic relationships as a measure of success. I'm thinking about traveling to Europe next year. I've always wanted to see the pottery traditions in different cultures, and I finally feel ready to take a trip like that on my own. Their parents exchanged glances that Maya recognized as surprised, mixed with pride. Victoria had never expressed interest in solo travel during her marriage, always assuming that significant experiences should be shared with a romantic partner. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," their mother said warmly. "You should definitely pursue something that excites you." Maya cut Victoria's eye across the table and smiled. Her sister was finally receiving the support and encouragement she'd always deserved based on her authentic interests rather than her relationship status. As autumn arrived, marking a full year since Victoria's separation, Maya received another text from her sister. This time, however, the message was filled with gratitude rather than desperation. "Maya, I just wanted to thank you for being patient with me while I figured things out. I know I wasn't always easy to deal with, especially when I was trying to convince myself that everything was fine with Marcus. You showed me what genuine contentment looks like, and you helped me find my own version of it. I love you." Maya smiled as she read the message, feeling grateful for the growth they'd both experienced. Victoria's journey towards self-acceptance had strengthened their relationship in ways Maya hadn't expected. They now talked regularly, not because Victoria needed advice, but because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company and perspectives. The sister who had once declared that Maya would never be happy without a romantic relationship had discovered her own capacity for joy and fulfillment as a single woman. More importantly, she'd learned that happiness wasn't a one-size-fits-all formula, and that the most important relationship anyone could cultivate was the one with themselves. Maya's own life continued to flourish as well. Her teaching career reached new heights when she was invited to collaborate on a statewide curriculum development project. Her book club expanded into a community writing workshop that helped local residents explore their own creative voices. Her volunteer work at the animal shelter led to a part-time position coordinating their adoption programs. The cats she'd fostered became permanent members of her household, bringing daily joy and companionship to her routines. Her hiking photography had improved enough that a local gallery featured her work in a group show celebrating Pacific Northwest landscapes. Her social calendar remained full of meaningful connections and enriching activities.
But perhaps the most significant change was in how Maya viewed her own journey. She'd always been confident in her choices, but Victoria's transformation had validated something important: that the path Maya had chosen wasn't just right for her, but offered valuable lessons for anyone willing to prioritize authenticity over conformity. During one of their regular coffee dates, Victoria asked Maya a question that showed how much she'd grown. "Do you ever think about dating now?" Victoria asked, stirring honey into her latte. "Not because you need to, but because you want to." Maya considered the question thoughtfully. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but only if it would add to my life rather than complete it. I'm open to meeting someone who shares my values and enhances the happiness I've already built, but I'm not looking for someone to provide what I should be giving myself." Victoria nodded with understanding. "That's exactly what I was missing before. I was trying to use Marcus to fix things about myself that only I could address. No wonder it didn't work." The conversation represented a complete shift from the dynamics that had defined their relationship for years. Victoria no longer saw Maya's single status as a problem to be solved, and Maya no longer felt defensive about her choices. They'd both learned that happiness came in many forms, and that the most important relationship was the one with oneself. As winter approached again, Maya reflected on the extraordinary year that had transformed her relationship with her sister and reinforced her own understanding of fulfillment. Victoria's crisis had ultimately become a gift to both of them, forcing long overdue conversations and realizations. The sister who had once pitied Maya's independence now celebrated it. The woman who had insisted that marriage was the only path to happiness had discovered her own capacity for joy and self-direction. And Maya had learned that sometimes the most powerful way to help someone was simply to live authentically and wait for them to recognize the value of that example. Their story had become one of growth, understanding, and the recognition that happiness wasn't a competition, but a deeply personal journey that looked different for everyone. Victoria's desperate text message had marked her own path to contentment, and Maya's patient support had helped her sister discover strengths she'd never known she possessed. In the end, they'd both learned that the most important relationship advice anyone could offer was this: learn to be happy with yourself first, and everything else becomes a choice rather than a desperate need. The phone call came on a crisp December morning while Maya was grading final exams in her classroom after school. The winter light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across student desks as she worked in the peaceful quiet that settled over the building once classes ended. Her phone buzzed insistently, and she glanced at the screen to see Victoria's name, which had become a welcome sight over the past several months. "Hey, how's the pottery class going?" Maya answered, expecting to hear about Victoria's latest ceramic creation or plans for the weekend farmers market. Instead, Victoria's voice carried an edge of excitement mixed with something that sounded like nervous energy. "Maya, something incredible happened today, and I need to tell someone who will understand what this means." Maya set down her red pen and leaned back in her desk chair, giving her sister her full attention. Over the past year, Victoria had become much better at recognizing significant moments and processing them thoughtfully, rather than rushing into decisions based on external pressure or expectations. "I'm listening," Maya said warmly, settling in for what she sensed would be an important conversation. Victoria took a deep breath that Maya could hear through the phone. "I met someone today, but before you say anything, this isn't like before. This is completely different, and I need you to help me think through what it means." Maya felt a familiar protective instinct rise in her chest. Victoria had made such remarkable progress in building her independent life that the thought of her sister potentially derailing that growth for a new romantic interest was concerning. But she'd learned to trust Victoria's judgment more over the recent months, and something in her sister's tone suggested this situation was indeed different from past patterns. "Tell me about it," Maya said, keeping her voice neutral and supportive rather than immediately cautionary. Victoria's story unfolded slowly, with careful attention to details that revealed how much she'd grown in self-awareness. She'd been at the community pottery studio where she'd been working on a large vase intended for the spring art show. The studio was typically quiet on Thursday afternoons, with most of the regular students attending evening classes. She'd been completely absorbed in shaping the clay, losing track of time in the meditative rhythm of the work, when someone had quietly taken the wheel at the station across from her. Normally, Victoria explained, she would have felt self-conscious about a stranger observing her technique, but she'd become confident enough in her skills to focus on her own project rather than worrying about external judgment. "I didn't even look up for the first hour," Victoria said, a smile evident in her voice. "I was so focused on getting the proportions right for this vase. But eventually I realized that whoever was working across from me had the same level of concentration. There was this comfortable, quiet energy that I'd never experienced with another person." When Victoria finally did look up, she found herself looking at a man roughly her age with clay-stained hands and an expression of complete focus on his own project. He was working on what appeared to be a set of small bowls, each one slightly different but clearly part of a cohesive collection. His dark hair was pulled back in a small ponytail, and he wore a simple gray sweater that clearly had seen many pottery sessions. What struck me first wasn't how he looked, but how peaceful he seemed. There was no performance or attempt to impress anyone. He was just completely present with his work, the same way I've learned to be. The man had eventually noticed Victoria's attention and offered a brief smile before returning to his bowls. They worked in companionable silence for another hour before the studio's afternoon session ended, and they both began cleaning their workstations. "I've been coming here for 8 months, Victoria said, "and I've never seen anyone work with that kind of quiet confidence. Most people, myself included when I started, are either trying too hard or apologizing for their mistakes. He just seemed completely comfortable with the process." As they cleaned up, the man had introduced himself as David Park, a middle school science teacher who'd been doing pottery for several years. He mentioned that he usually attended evening classes but had switched to afternoons temporarily while teaching an after-school robotics program. The conversation was so different from any first meeting I've had with a man, Victoria told Maya, her voice filled with wonder. "We didn't talk about what we did for work or where we lived or any of the usual first meeting topics. We talked about clay, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional, about how pottery had become a form of meditation for both of us. Maya listened carefully, noting the genuine enthusiasm in Victoria's voice, but also the thoughtful way she was processing the encounter. This wasn't the breathless infatuation that had characterized Victoria's previous relationships, but something more grounded and reflective. He asked if I'd been working on pottery long, and when I told him about starting after my divorce, he nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. Then he said something that really stuck with me. Sometimes we need to learn to shape clay before we can shape our lives. The comment had resonated deeply with Victoria, who recognized the truth in David's observation. Her pottery practice had indeed been instrumental in her personal transformation, teaching her patience, acceptance of imperfection, and the satisfaction of creating something meaningful with her own hands. Before leaving the studio, David had mentioned that he usually spent Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, often stopping by a coffee booth run by a local roaster. He suggested that if Victoria was ever there with her pottery pieces, she might enjoy their breakfast blend, which paired perfectly with the peaceful atmosphere of the market. It wasn't really an invitation, Victoria clarified to Maya. It was more like sharing information about something he enjoyed with an opening for me to join if I was interested. There was no pressure or expectation, just a genuine suggestion based on mutual interests. Maya found herself impressed by the subtlety and respect inherent in David's approach. This was dramatically different from the aggressive pursuit or grand romantic gestures that had characterized Victoria's previous relationships. It suggested a man who was secure enough in himself to offer connection without demanding immediate commitment or response. "What are you thinking about doing?" Maya asked, genuinely curious about Victoria's perspective rather than preparing to offer unsolicited advice. Victoria paused before answering, and Maya could hear her sister thinking through her response. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. A year ago, I would have spent the entire evening analyzing every word he said, looking up his social media, and planning the perfect outfit to wear to the farmer's market. But now I'm approaching this completely differently. Instead of obsessing over David's potential interest or trying to manufacture the perfect romantic encounter, Victoria was considering whether his presence would enhance her existing Saturday morning routine rather than disrupt it. She genuinely enjoyed her weekly visits to the farmer's market, using the time to select ingredients for the week, chat with vendors she'd gotten to know, and often discovering new pottery pieces by local artists. "I realized that I like who I am on Saturday mornings," Victoria said thoughtfully. "I'm relaxed, curious, engaged with my community, and completely comfortable with my own company. If David's presence would add to that experience without changing who I am in that space, then maybe I'd like to see him there." Maya felt a surge of pride hearing her sister articulate such a healthy approach to potential romance. Victoria had learned to value her authentic self highly enough that she wouldn't compromise it for the sake of impressing someone else or securing their attention. "That sounds like incredibly healthy thinking," Maya said sincerely. "You're considering whether someone would fit into your life rather than how you could reshape yourself to fit into theirs." "Exactly," Victoria replied, sounding relieved that Maya understood her perspective. And that's what feels so different about this whole thing. I'm not looking at David as someone who might complete me or solve some problem in my life. I'm curious about him as a person who seems to have similar values and interests. They talked for another 30 minutes, with Maya mostly listening as Victoria worked through her thoughts and feelings about the encounter. It became clear that Victoria's growth over the past year had fundamentally changed how she approached potential relationships. Instead of seeking validation or trying to fulfill societal expectations, she was now capable of genuine connection based on mutual respect and shared interests. "I think I will go to the farmer's market on Saturday," Victoria concluded. "Not because I'm hoping for some romantic outcome, but because I genuinely enjoyed the experience. And if David's there, I'd be interested in continuing our conversation about pottery and maybe learning about his other interests." Maya smiled at her sister's measured approach.
That sounds perfect. You're honoring what you enjoyed about meeting him while staying true to your own routine and values. After they ended their conversation, Maya reflected on how dramatically Victoria's perspective on relationships had evolved. The sister who had once measured her worth by her ability to attract and keep a romantic partner now approached potential connections with confidence and discernment. Victoria was no longer desperate for male attention or willing to compromise her authentic self for the sake of being in a relationship. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that made winter farmers markets particularly appealing. Victoria dressed in her usual weekend attire, comfortable jeans, warm boots, and a navy wool coat that she'd chosen for practicality rather than its effect on potential observers. She braided her hair loosely and wore minimal makeup, the same approach she'd taken to Saturday mornings for the past several months. The market was bustling with its regular mix of vendors and customers, creating the lively but unhurried atmosphere that Victoria had grown to love. She followed her usual route, starting with the vegetable stands to plan the week's meals, then moving to the artisan booths to see what new pottery and crafts had appeared since her last visit. At the coffee booth David had mentioned, she found herself genuinely curious about the breakfast blend he'd recommended. The vendor, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and bright eyes, enthusiastically described the coffee's notes of caramel and chocolate, perfect for crisp winter mornings. She had just received her steaming cup when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "The breakfast blend is excellent, isn't it?" David said, approaching with his own coffee and a canvas bag that suggested he'd been shopping at the market for a while. Victoria turned and smiled, noting that her reaction was of genuine pleasure rather than nervous excitement. "You were right about this," she said, raising her cup. "It's exactly what a Saturday morning should taste like."
That's a perfect way to put it. I've never been able to explain why this particular coffee feels different from what I make at home, but you captured it exactly. They found themselves walking together through the market, their conversation flowing naturally from coffee to the vendors they both enjoyed to observations about seasonal changes in available produce. David mentioned that he'd been coming to this market for 3 years and had developed relationships with several vendors who saved specific items for him. "The woman who makes those ceramic planters always sets aside the ones with unusual glazes because she knows I appreciate the experimental work," he said, gesturing toward a booth they were approaching. "And the organic farmer holds back some of his smaller tomatoes because he knows I like them for making sauce in small batches." Victoria found herself impressed by David's integration into the market community. Rather than simply shopping for goods, he'd built genuine relationships based on shared appreciation for quality and craftsmanship. It suggested someone who valued connection and took time to understand what others were passionate about. As they stopped at various booths, Victoria noticed that David's interactions with vendors were warm but respectful, showing genuine interest in their work without trying to dominate conversations or impress anyone with his knowledge. When the ceramic artist showed them a new glaze technique, David asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated both curiosity and understanding of the craft. "You clearly know a lot about pottery beyond just working with clay," Victoria observed as they moved away from the ceramic booth. David nodded, but without the pride or need for recognition that Victoria had learned to identify in her past relationships. "I've been doing it long enough to appreciate the technical side, but I'm still learning something new every time I sit down at the wheel. That's what I love about it. There's always room for growth and discovery." The comment resonated with Victoria's own experience of pottery as a practice rather than a performance. She discovered that her enjoyment came from the process itself, rather than from external validation of her finished pieces. They continued through the market, their conversation ranging from pottery techniques to teaching challenges to observations about the local community. Victoria found herself relaxing completely, engaging with David as she would with any friend whose company she enjoyed. When they reached the end of their market circuit, David paused near the parking area. "I've really enjoyed talking with you this morning," he said simply. "If you're interested in continuing the conversation sometime, I'd like that." Victoria appreciated the directness of his approach, which avoided games or unclear intentions, while still leaving her complete freedom to respond authentically. "I'd like that too," she said. Maybe we can have coffee after pottery class next week." They exchanged phone numbers with the same straightforward simplicity that had characterized their entire interaction. David suggested a cafe near the pottery studio that served excellent lunch options, and Victoria agreed to meet him there after their Thursday afternoon session. As Victoria drove home, she reflected on how different the morning had felt from any romantic encounter in her recent memory. There had been no performance or attempt to impress, no anxiety about whether she was being the right things or presenting herself in the most attractive light. Instead, she'd simply been herself, and David had seemed to appreciate her exactly as she was. That evening, Victoria called Maya to share her thoughts about the morning's interaction. "The most remarkable thing," Victoria said, curling up in her favorite chair with a cup of tea, "was how natural it felt to be myself around him. I didn't once think about whether I was being too independent or too opinionated or too focused on my own interests." Maya smiled at the growth evident in her sister's observation. "That's a wonderful sign. It means you've developed enough confidence in who you are that you don't feel the need to hide or modify yourself to be acceptable to someone else." "Exactly," Victoria agreed. "And David seemed to genuinely enjoy our conversations about pottery and teaching and community involvement. He wasn't trying to steer the discussion toward more typically romantic topics or find ways to impress me with his accomplishments." Their coffee date the following Thursday confirmed Victoria's initial impressions. David arrived at the cafe directly from his robotics program, still energized from working with middle school students on programming challenges. His enthusiasm for teaching was evident as he described the satisfaction of watching young people discover their problem-solving abilities. "There's something magical about the moment when a student realizes they can figure something out on their own," he said, his eyes lighting up with genuine passion. "It's not about May being a great teacher, it's about them discovering their own capabilities." Victoria found herself drawn to David's focus on empowering others, rather than seeking recognition for his own abilities. This was dramatically different from Marcus, who had viewed his professional success primarily as a reflection of his personal worth and had little interest in how his work affected other people. As they talked about their respective teaching experiences, Victoria shared her own discoveries about fostering independence and confidence in her pottery students. She'd begun assisting with beginner classes at the community studio, finding deep satisfaction in helping newcomers develop their own relationships with clay, rather than trying to replicate her techniques. "I love watching people stop apologizing for their imperfections and start embracing them as part of their unique style. Some of my favorite pieces from students are the ones they initially thought were mistakes." David nodded with understanding. "That's exactly what I try to teach in science class. The experiments that don't go according to plan often teach us more than the ones that work perfectly the first time." Their conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from teaching philosophies to travel dreams to their families' reactions to their respective career choices. Victoria found herself sharing stories about her relationship with Maya and the recent transformation in their dynamic, while David talked about his close relationship with his grandmother, who had taught him pottery during childhood visits to her studio. "My grandmother always said that clay teaches you patience because you can't force it into shapes it doesn't want to hold. That lesson has applied to pretty much every area of my life." Victoria felt a deep resonance with this philosophy, recognizing how her own attempts to force her marriage with Marcus to meet unrealistic expectations had ultimately led to disappointment and disconnection. David's approach to both pottery and life seemed to embrace organic development rather than rigid control. As they prepared to leave the cafe, David suggested that they might enjoy visiting a pottery exhibition opening at a gallery in the next town over. The featured artist was known for innovative glazing techniques that might interest them both as practitioners of the craft. "It's next Saturday afternoon if you're free. No pressure if you have other plans, but I think you'd appreciate her work." Victoria accepted the invitation, looking forward to experiencing David's company in a different setting while pursuing a shared interest. As she drove home, she reflected on how comfortable and natural their developing friendship felt. Over the following weeks, Victoria and David settled into a pattern of spending time together that felt organic rather than forced. They continued their Thursday afternoon pottery sessions, often staying late to work on more complex projects while discussing techniques and artistic inspirations. Their Saturday morning farmers market visits became a regular occurrence, with both of them appreciating the relaxed atmosphere for deepening their conversations. Maya watched her sister's gradual opening to this new relationship with a mixture of happiness and protective concern. Victoria seemed genuinely content and grounded, approaching her connection with David from a place of strength rather than need. But Maya couldn't help remembering how quickly Victoria's previous relationships had escalated from casual dating to serious commitment, often without adequate foundation. "Tell me how you're feeling about David," Maya said during one of their regular coffee conversations in January. "Not how you think you should feel, but how you actually experience being around him." Victoria considered the question thoughtfully, a practice that had become natural to her over the past year of intensive self-reflection. "Peaceful," she said finally. "That sounds strange for describing a romantic interest, but it's the most accurate word. I feel like I can be completely myself without any performance or editing." She went on to describe how David's presence in her life had enhanced, rather than disrupted, her existing routines and relationships. Her pottery continued to improve as they shared techniques and encouraged each other's artistic development. Her confidence in teaching beginners had grown through their discussions about educational philosophy. Even her friendships with other community members had deepened as David's perspective added new dimensions to familiar conversations. "He doesn't seem to need me to be anything other than who I already am," Victoria said, her voice filled with wonder at this revelation. "With Marcus, I was constantly trying to be more social or less independent or more focused on traditional relationship milestones. David seems to appreciate my independence and even encourages it." Maya felt reassured by her sister's thoughtful analysis. Victoria was clearly approaching this relationship with the wisdom she'd gained from her previous experiences, maintaining her hard-won sense of self while remaining open to genuine connection. The real test came in February, when David was offered an opportunity to attend a 3-week pottery workshop in New Mexico, studying with a master ceramicist whose techniques he'd admired for years. The timing was complicated. It would mean missing several of their regular pottery sessions and Saturday market visits, disrupting the routine they'd established. Victoria's reaction to David's news revealed how much she'd grown in emotional maturity and security. Instead of feeling threatened by his absence or trying to discourage him from pursuing an opportunity that didn't include her, she was genuinely excited about the professional development the workshop would provide. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity you should pursue," she told him when he somewhat hesitantly shared the news. "Learning from someone whose work you admire will influence your own pottery in ways that will last for years." David seemed surprised and relieved by Victoria's supportive response. "I was worried you might feel like I was abandoning our routine or that 3 weeks was too long to be apart," he admitted. Victoria realized that David's concern reflected his own past relationship experiences, possibly with partners who had been less secure about independence and personal growth. Her enthusiastic support clearly meant more to him than she'd initially realized. "David, your growth as an artist and as a person makes you more interesting to be around, not less," she said firmly. "I want to be with someone who pursues their passions, not someone who limits themselves to make me feel more secure." The conversation revealed how much both Victoria and David had learned from previous relationships about the importance of maintaining individual identity within romantic partnership. Neither of them was looking for someone to complete them, but rather someone who would celebrate and encourage their continued personal development. During David's absence, Victoria discovered that she genuinely missed his company while also thoroughly enjoying the return to her independent routine. She used the time to focus intensively on a large pottery project she'd been planning, a series of planters for her apartment that required techniques she'd been afraid to attempt while dividing her attention between personal work and social activities. She also strengthened her relationships with other friends in the pottery community, spending more time with fellow students and taking on additional teaching responsibilities at the studio. The experience reinforced her understanding that healthy relationships should enhance rather than replace other meaningful connections in her life. Maya observed her sister's navigation of David's absence with admiration and relief. Victoria showed none of the anxiety or possessiveness that had characterized her behavior during Marcus's business trips. Instead, she seemed to view the separation as a natural part of supporting someone she cared about and pursuing their goals. I actually appreciate having this time to focus on my own projects. It's helping me remember that I'm perfectly content with my own company, and that David's presence in my life is a choice rather than a necessity. When David returned from New Mexico, he was full of enthusiasm for new techniques he'd learned and excited to share his experiences with Victoria. More importantly, his time away had given him perspective on how much he valued their relationship and the supportive dynamic they'd created together. I kept thinking about conversations we'd had and wishing you could see some of the work we were doing. It made me realize how much I appreciate having someone who truly understands what pottery means to me. Victoria felt touched by David's desire to share his experiences with her, recognizing it as a sign of genuine intimacy rather than mere romantic sentiment. He valued her perspective and understanding, seeing her as a true partner in his artistic journey rather than simply an audience for his achievements. As spring arrived, Victoria and David's relationship continued to deepen in ways that felt natural and sustainable. They spent increasing amounts of time together, but always in pursuit of shared interests or mutual support, rather than from a sense of obligation or fear of being alone. Victoria noticed that her feelings for David had grown gradually and steadily, based on accumulated evidence of his character and compatibility, rather than sudden infatuation or external pressure. "I think I'm falling in love with him," Victoria confided to Maya during a late-night phone conversation. "But it feels so different from anything I've experienced before. It's based on actually knowing who he is, rather than projecting what I want him to be." Maya felt her heart swell with happiness and pride at her sister's growth. Victoria had learned to distinguish between genuine compatibility and wishful thinking, between love based on reality and infatuation based on fantasy. "How does that feel?" Maya asked, genuinely curious about Victoria's emotional experience of this healthier approach to love.
"Peaceful," Victoria said, using the same words she'd applied to David's presence in her life months earlier. "And certain, in a way I've never felt before. I'm not worried about whether he'll change his mind about me or whether I'm enough for him. I know we work well together because we've had months to observe how we handle different situations and challenges." The certainty Victoria described was based on concrete evidence rather than hope or desperation. She and David had navigated his 3-week absence, differences of opinion about pottery techniques, scheduling conflicts between their teaching responsibilities, and various minor stresses that revealed their problem-solving styles and communication patterns. More importantly, Victoria had maintained her hard-won sense of independence and self-worth throughout their relationship's development. She continued to pursue her own interests, maintain her friendships, and make decisions based on her personal values rather than trying to please David or secure his commitment. "I realize that I don't need him to love me," Victoria said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "I want him to love me, and I believe he does. But my happiness and sense of worth don't depend on his feelings about me. That makes it possible for me to love him freely rather than desperately." As their conversation continued, Victoria shared her growing sense that David represented the kind of partnership she'd always hoped was possible, but had never experienced. He supported her independence rather than feeling threatened by it, celebrated her successes without trying to compete with them, and approached conflict with curiosity rather than defensiveness. "When we disagree about something, he actually listens to my perspective instead of just waiting for his turn to talk," Victoria said, marveling at this basic respect that had been missing from her marriage with Marcus. "And he changes his mind sometimes when I make good points, which shows that he values my intelligence rather than just tolerating it." Maya recognized these as signs of genuine respect and partnership, the foundation of healthy, long-term relationships. David's ability to see Victoria as an equal partner rather than a romantic trophy or emotional support system suggested that he brought his own sense of completeness to their relationship.
As summer approached, Victoria found herself in the unfamiliar but wonderful position of being genuinely happy in a romantic relationship while maintaining her individual identity and independence. The growth she'd achieved during her year of singlehood hadn't been sacrificed for the sake of partnership, but rather provided the foundation for a much healthier dynamic than she'd ever experienced before. The transformation wasn't lost on their family and friends, who noticed that Victoria seemed more relaxed and confident than she had during her marriage to Marcus. There was no performance or anxiety in her relationship with David, no constant need for validation or reassurance about their future together. "You seem like yourself again," their mother observed during a family barbecue where David had been invited to join them. "But even more than when you were younger, more settled in who you are." Victoria appreciated her mother's recognition of her personal growth. The young woman who had sought validation through romantic relationships had evolved into someone who could offer genuine partnership from a place of strength and self-knowledge. As Maya watched her sister's continued flourishing, she felt grateful for the journey that had brought Victoria to this point of wisdom and authenticity. The crisis that had driven Victoria to seek Maya's advice about relationships had ultimately led to the most healthy and sustainable romantic connection of Victoria's life. More importantly, Victoria had learned to value her own happiness and growth as the foundation for any successful relationship. She approached love as an extension of her already fulfilling life, rather than as a solution to emptiness or insecurity. This shift in perspective had transformed not only her romantic possibilities, but her entire approach to connection and intimacy. The sister who had once pitied Maya's single status and insisted that marriage was the only path to happiness had discovered something even more valuable: the ability to choose love from a place of wholeness rather than need. And that choice, made with wisdom and self-respect, had led to the kind of partnership that enhanced both people involved rather than diminishing either one of them. As Victoria continued to grow in her relationship with David while maintaining her hard-won independence and self-awareness, Maya realized that her sister's transformation represented something bigger than personal growth. Victoria had learned that the most important relationship anyone could have was with themselves, and that all other connections flowed from that foundation of self-love and respect. The journey was far from over, but Victoria had acquired the tools and perspective necessary to navigate whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. She had learned to trust her own judgment, maintain her boundaries, and pursue her authentic desires rather than conforming to external expectations about what her life should look like. And, perhaps most importantly, she had learned that happiness truly did come in many forms, and that the path she'd once dismissed as inadequate had actually been exactly what she needed to find genuine fulfillment and love. The morning of Maya's 31st birthday arrived, with the golden light of early autumn filtering through her bedroom windows. She woke up naturally, without an alarm, feeling the deep contentment that had become her normal state over the past few years. Her 3 rescue cats were arranged around her on the bed like furry guardians, purring softly as she stretched and considered her plans for the day. It had been 2 years since Victoria's desperate text message had changed the trajectory of their relationship, and Maya marveled at how much both their lives had transformed. Victoria was now living with David in a charming cottage they'd rented together, complete with a converted garage that served as their shared pottery studio. Their relationship had progressed with the same thoughtful consideration that had characterized its beginning, each milestone reached through mutual discussion and genuine readiness, rather than external pressure or artificial timelines. Maya's phone buzzed with the first of what surely would be many birthday messages. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, and Maya smiled as she read Victoria's heartfelt words. "Happy birthday to the wisest woman I know. Thank you for showing me what real happiness looks like, and for having the patience to wait while I figured out how to find my own version of it. I love you more than pottery, and you know that's saying something. Can't wait to celebrate with you tonight." The message was followed by a photo of an elegant ceramic vase that Victoria had clearly been working on for weeks. The glaze was a stunning combination of deep blues and silver that seemed to capture the essence of ocean waves under moonlight. Maya recognized it as the culmination of techniques Victoria had been perfecting since David's return from New Mexico, and she felt proud of her sister's artistic development alongside her personal growth. Maya's birthday celebration that evening was a reflection of the rich, multifaceted life she'd built over the years. Her apartment was filled with friends from various aspects of her world, colleagues from the high school where she now served as department chair, members of her book club that had evolved into a literary salon featuring visiting authors, fellow volunteers from the animal shelter where she'd recently been elected to the board of directors, and hiking companions who'd become like family through shared adventures in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Victoria and David arrived early to help with preparations, bringing not only the beautiful vase as Maya's birthday gift, but also homemade bread that David had baked using techniques he learned from a traditional baker at the farmer's market. Maya watched her sister move through her apartment with easy familiarity, arranging flowers in the vase and setting out appetizers with the confidence of someone who felt completely comfortable in her own skin. The transformation in Victoria was remarkable, not just in its extent, but in its authenticity. She no longer performed happiness or success for external validation, but radiated genuine contentment that came from alignment between her values and her daily choices. The relationship with David had deepened their individual growth rather than stunting it, and Maya could see that both partners brought their full selves to their connection rather than diminished versions designed to avoid conflict or maintain artificial harmony. As guests began arriving, Maya noticed how naturally Victoria interacted with people she'd met through Maya's world. There was no competition or comparison, no attempt to establish social hierarchy or position herself as more accomplished or interesting than others. Victoria engaged with Maya's hiking friends about trail recommendations with genuine curiosity, discussed literature with book club members despite her limited background in the subject, and shared pottery techniques with anyone who expressed interest in her artistic practice.
The evening's highlight came when Maya's colleague Sarah, a fellow English teacher who'd become one of her closest friends, raised a toast that captured something Maya hadn't fully recognized about her own journey. "To Maya," Sarah said, lifting her glass of wine as conversation quieted around the room, "who taught all of us that there's no single formula for a meaningful life, and that the courage to live authentically creates ripple effects that touch everyone around us. Your example of choosing fulfillment over conformity has influenced more people than you probably realize." Maya felt tears spring to her eyes at the unexpected recognition. She'd never thought of her choices as particularly brave or influential, but looking around the room at the diverse group of people who'd been drawn into her orbit, she began to understand that living according to personal values rather than external expectations had indeed created something valuable for her entire community. Victoria approached Maya as the evening wound down, helping to collect glasses and plates while the last guests said their goodbyes. Her expression was thoughtful, and Maya recognized the look that indicated her sister was processing something significant. "Can we talk for a few minutes before David and I head home?" Victoria asked quietly. "There's something I want to share with you, and tonight feels like the right time." After the apartment was restored to order and David was settled in the living room with a book and one of Maya's cats, the sisters retreated to Maya's bedroom for the kind of private conversation that had become precious to both of them over recent years. Victoria sat cross-legged on Maya's bed, her posture relaxed but her expression serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what Sarah said tonight, about your example creating ripple effects. I don't think you fully understand how much your way of living has influenced not just me, but probably dozens of people who've watched you choose authenticity over acceptance." Maya settled beside her sister, curious about where this reflection was leading. Victoria had become skilled at articulating insights about personal growth and relationships, but there was something different in her tone tonight. Something that suggested a deeper level of recognition or understanding. "When I first asked for your relationship advice 2 years ago, I thought I was just dealing with problems in my marriage," Victoria continued. "I didn't realize I was actually asking you to teach me how to live from the inside out instead of the outside in. Everything you'd been doing all those years when I thought you were missing out was actually you building exactly the kind of foundation that makes healthy relationships possible." Victoria went on to explain how her relationship with David had flourished precisely because she'd learned to approach love from a place of wholeness rather than need. The skills she developed during her year of intentional singlehood, the ability to enjoy her own company, pursue her authentic interests, maintain meaningful friendships, and make decisions based on personal values rather than external pressure, had become the bedrock of her partnership with David. "I understand now why you never seemed desperate to settle down or compromise your standards," Victoria said, her voice filled with gratitude and wonder. "You knew instinctively that the right relationship would enhance your existing happiness rather than create it from scratch, and you were willing to wait for that, even when everyone around you was suggesting you lower your expectations." Maya felt moved by her sister's recognition, but also curious about what had prompted this particular reflection on her birthday evening. Victoria seemed to be building towards something more specific than general appreciation for their transformed relationship. "There is something else," Victoria said, her voice taking on a note of excitement mixed with nervousness. "David and I have been talking about getting married, and I wanted you to be the first person I shared this with because your guidance has been so crucial to making this decision from a healthy place." Maya's heart filled with joy at the news, but she was even more impressed by the thoughtful process Victoria described for reaching this conclusion. Instead of rushing toward marriage as validation of their relationship's success or as the next expected milestone, Victoria and David had spent months discussing their individual and shared goals, their approaches to conflict resolution, their financial philosophies, and their visions for how marriage would enhance rather than replace their existing dynamic. "We both want marriage because we're excited about the deeper commitment and legal recognition it would provide, not because we think it will solve problems or make us more complete, but because we want to make a public declaration about our intention to support each other's growth and dreams for the long term." Victoria went on to share that they'd discussed everything from career ambitions to family planning to retirement dreams, ensuring their compatibility extended far beyond romantic attraction and shared interests in pottery. They'd also attended several sessions with a couples counselor, not to address problems, but to develop communication skills and establish frameworks for navigating future challenges together. "The most amazing thing," Victoria said, her eyes bright with happiness, "is planning for marriage has made me even more grateful for the time I spent learning to be content alone. I'm not entering this partnership from a place of fear or desperation, but from genuine excitement about building something beautiful with someone who appreciates all the parts of myself that I worked so hard to understand and accept." Maya embraced her sister warmly, feeling overwhelmed with pride and happiness at Victoria's transformation and wisdom. The woman who had once measured her worth through others' validation and had criticized Maya's independence was now approaching marriage with exactly the kind of self-awareness and intentionality that Maya had always hoped would be possible for her. "I'm so happy for you," Maya said sincerely, "and I'm proud of how thoughtfully you're approaching this decision. It sounds like you and David are creating exactly the kind of partnership that will support both of your individual flourishing as well as your shared dreams." Victoria nodded, then took Maya's hands in hers. "Maya, I want you to be my maid of honor, but more than that, I want you to know that you'll always be one of the most important relationships in my life. Marriage with David isn't going to diminish my appreciation for what I've learned from you or change the fact that our sisterhood has become one of my greatest sources of strength and joy." The request touched Maya deeply, representing not just Victoria's desire for her presence at the wedding, but recognition of the transformed dynamic between them. They'd evolved from a relationship characterized by competition and criticism to one based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared wisdom. As Victoria and David prepared to leave that evening, Maya reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken since her sister's desperate text message 2 years earlier. She'd always been content with her independent lifestyle, but watching Victoria's transformation and being trusted with her sister's most vulnerable moments had added new dimensions to Maya's understanding of connection and intimacy. The role reversal that had begun with Victoria seeking Maya's relationship advice had evolved into something more profound, a mutual recognition that happiness came in many forms and that the most important relationship anyone could cultivate was with themselves. Victoria had learned this lesson through the painful dissolution of her marriage to Marcus and the subsequent journey of self-discovery, while Maya had intuited it early and built her entire adult life around its principles. Over the following months, Maya found herself deeply involved in Victoria and David's wedding planning process, not as someone trying to impose her vision on their celebration, but as a trusted advisor who understood both partners' values and priorities. The couple had decided on a small ceremony in the community garden where David volunteered, followed by a reception at the pottery studio where they'd first met. The wedding preparations revealed how much Victoria's approach to major life events had matured. Instead of focusing on creating an impressive display for social media or trying to meet others' expectations about what a wedding should look like, Victoria and David designed every element of their celebration to reflect their authentic selves and genuine priorities. We want people to leave our wedding feeling like they understand who we are as individuals and as a couple, Victoria explained, as she showed Maya fabric swatches for table runners that would coordinate with centerpieces made from pottery they'd created together. Everything should feel like us, not like what we think a wedding is supposed to look like. Maya was moved by her sister's commitment to authenticity, remembering Victoria's previous wedding with Marcus, which had been an elaborate production designed to impress others rather than celebrate the couple's actual relationship. This time, every detail, from the locally sourced menu to the acoustic music performed by friends, reflected Victoria and David's shared values and genuine preferences. As summer arrived and the wedding date approached, Maya noticed that Victoria's excitement about marriage was balanced by continued investment in her individual pursuits and relationships. She maintained her teaching responsibilities at the pottery studio, continued her weekly coffee dates with Maya, and even planned a solo trip to visit pottery studios in North Carolina, understanding that marriage should enhance rather than replace her personal interests and independence. The transformation wasn't limited to Victoria's approach to romantic relationships. Her friendships had deepened as she'd learned to show up authentically.
Her relationship with their parents had improved as she'd stopped seeking their validation for her choices and started sharing her genuine thoughts and feelings about her life. Maya watched these changes with deep satisfaction, recognizing that Victoria's growth had created positive effects throughout their entire family system. Their parents had begun to understand that both daughters were capable of creating meaningful lives in their own ways, and family gatherings had become more relaxed and genuine as a result. The most significant shift came when their mother confided in Maya during a quiet moment at Victoria's bridal shower. "I owe you an apology," their mother said as they arranged flowers in the pottery vases that served as decorations. "For years, I worried about you being single and focused all my attention on Victoria's romantic relationships. I didn't understand that you were actually building exactly the kind of life that makes a person ready for healthy partnership when the right person comes along." Maya felt moved by her mother's recognition and growth. The family dynamics that had once positioned Victoria as the successful daughter and Maya as the one who needed guidance had evolved into something more balanced and respectful of both women's choices and achievements. "I see now that Victoria's happiness with David is possible because she learned to be happy with herself first," her mother continued, "and she learned that from watching you live that way for years. You were modeling something important that I didn't recognize at the time." The conversation represented a healing that Maya hadn't even realized she'd needed. Her mother's acknowledgement of her wisdom and influence felt like validation of choices that had sometimes been difficult to maintain in the face of family pressure and societal expectations. Victoria's wedding day arrived with perfect summer weather and an atmosphere of joy that reflected the authentic celebration the couple had planned. Maya stood beside her sister as maid of honor, wearing a dress she'd chosen for comfort and personal style, rather than to meet anyone else's expectations about wedding attire. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with Victoria and David exchanging vows they'd written to reflect their specific commitments to supporting each other's individual growth, as well as their shared dreams. Maya felt tears of happiness as she watched her sister promise to love David not just as he is today, but as he becomes through all the changes and growth that life will bring. The reception was a joyful reflection of the community Victoria and David had built together. Guests included family members, fellow teachers, pottery students and instructors, farmers market vendors who'd become friends, and neighbors from their cottage. The conversation flowed easily between different groups, united by their affection for the couple and appreciation for the authentic celebration. Maya found herself in conversation with David's grandmother, the woman who had first taught him pottery during childhood visits and who had traveled from California to attend the wedding. At 87, she radiated the same peaceful confidence that Maya had noticed in David, and she shared stories about watching her grandson develop both as an artist and as a person. David was always sensitive to beauty and meaning, his grandmother said as they watched the newlyweds dance to acoustic music performed by friends. But Victoria has brought out something in him that I hadn't seen before. She makes him more himself, if that makes sense, more confident in expressing his thoughts and feelings. Maya understood exactly what David's grandmother meant. Healthy relationships didn't change people fundamentally, but rather created safe space for them to express their authentic selves more fully. Victoria and David seemed to bring out each other's best qualities while maintaining their individual identities and interests. As the evening progressed, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Victoria's crisis 2 years earlier had seemed devastating at the time, but it had ultimately led to the kind of growth and transformation that enabled genuine partnership. The sister who had once pitied Maya's single status and insisted that marriage was the only path to happiness had discovered something even more valuable: the ability to choose love from a place of wholeness rather than desperation. Late in the evening, as guests began to depart and the cleanup process started, Victoria approached Maya with a small wrapped package. "This is for you," Victoria said, her eyes bright with happiness and gratitude. "Not just for being my maid of honor, but for being the kind of sister who taught me what real strength looks like." Inside the package was a small ceramic bowl, clearly one of Victoria's own creations, glazed in the same deep blues and silver that had characterized the vase she'd given Maya for her birthday. But this piece was different, more refined and confident, representing months of technical development and artistic growth. "I made this while thinking about everything you've taught me about building a life from the inside out," Victoria explained. "It's meant to hold whatever brings you joy, tea or soup or flowers or just beautiful light, like you taught me to do with my whole life." Maya felt overwhelmed by the gift's symbolic meaning and artistic beauty. The bowl represented not just Victoria's technical skill, but her transformation from someone who sought external validation to someone who created beauty for the sake of authentic expression. As Maya drove home that night, still wearing her bridesmaid's dress and carrying Victoria's gift carefully beside her, she reflected on the unexpected ways her life had been enriched by her sister's journey towards self-awareness and healthy love. She'd always been content with her independent lifestyle, but being trusted with Victoria's most vulnerable moments and watching her sister's transformation had added new dimensions to Maya's understanding of connection and meaning. The role reversal that had begun with Victoria's desperate request for relationship advice had evolved into something more profound, a mutual recognition that happiness came in many forms, and that the most important relationship anyone could cultivate was with themselves. Victoria had learned this lesson through crisis and difficult growth, while Maya had intuited it early and built her entire adult life around its principles. As autumn returned and the newlyweds settled into married life, Maya found herself reflecting on her own romantic prospects with a new sense of openness. She'd always maintained that she was happy to remain single until the right person came along, but Victoria's successful partnership with David had reinforced her understanding of what right actually meant in the context of healthy relationships.
The right person would appreciate her independence rather than feeling threatened by it, celebrate her accomplishments without trying to compete with them, and approach conflict with curiosity rather than defensiveness. They would bring their own sense of completeness to the relationship rather than expecting Maya to fill gaps in their self-esteem or life satisfaction. Maya had learned from watching Victoria's journey that love based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility was worth waiting for, no matter how long that wait might be. She wasn't desperate for romantic partnership, but she remained open to the possibility that someone might enter her life who would enhance rather than complicate her existing happiness. This openness proved significant when Maya attended a regional education conference in November and found herself in conversation with Daniel Martinez, a high school principal from a neighboring district who'd been invited to speak about innovative approaches to student engagement. Their initial conversation about educational philosophy evolved naturally into discussions of literature, community involvement, and personal values. Daniel was impressive not just in his professional accomplishments, but in his thoughtful approach to leadership and his genuine interest in others' perspectives. He asked Maya thoughtful questions about her teaching methods and listened carefully to her responses, showing the kind of intellectual curiosity and respect that Maya had learned to value highly. When Daniel suggested they continue their conversation over coffee during the conference's lunch break, Maya found herself genuinely interested in learning more about his approach to education and his thoughts on various topics they had touched on during their initial discussion. Their coffee conversation confirmed Maya's initial positive impression. Daniel was accomplished without being arrogant, passionate about his work without being unable to discuss other topics, and comfortable with himself without being closed to new ideas or perspectives. Most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in Maya as a complete person, rather than focusing primarily on romantic possibilities. "I'd love to continue our conversation sometime after the conference," Daniel said as they prepared to return to their respective sessions. "Maybe you'd be interested in visiting the innovative learning spaces we've created at my school."
And I'd enjoy seeing some of the programs you've developed at your district. Maya appreciated the professional focus of Daniel's invitation, which suggested someone who valued her expertise and ideas, rather than simply pursuing romantic connection. She agreed to visit his school the following month, looking forward to learning about his educational innovations while continuing to get to know him as a person. Over the following weeks, Maya found herself thinking about Daniel with the same thoughtful curiosity that had characterized Victoria's early attraction to David. This wasn't the desperate infatuation or anxious analysis that she'd observed in some of her friends' romantic pursuits, but genuine interest in someone whose values and approach to life seemed compatible with her own. Their school visit confirmed Maya's positive impression. Daniel's leadership style was collaborative and supportive, focused on empowering both students and teachers to pursue excellence rather than demanding compliance with rigid structures. His passion for education was evident in every aspect of the programs he'd developed. But he was equally interested in Maya's innovations and eager to learn from her approaches to literature instruction and student engagement. When Daniel suggested dinner after their school tour, Maya accepted with the confidence that came from knowing someone well enough to trust their intentions and compatibility. Their dinner conversation ranged from professional interests to personal values to future goals, with the easy flow that indicated genuine connection rather than performed attraction. "I have to admit," Daniel said as they walked to their cars after dinner, "I was hoping this evening would go well because I'd like to see you again. But I also want you to know that I appreciate our professional connection regardless of whether there's potential for anything more personal." Maya felt impressed by Daniel's straightforward approach, which honored both the possibility of romantic interest and the value of their connection independent of that outcome. This was exactly the kind of respectful, secure communication that she'd learned to recognize as a sign of emotional maturity. "I'd like to see you again, too," Maya replied honestly. "I'm enjoying getting to know you, and I appreciate your direct communication about your intentions." As Maya drove home that evening, she reflected on how different this felt from the dating experiences she'd observed in others or the few romantic connections she'd pursued in previous years.
There was no anxiety about whether she was presenting herself correctly or whether Daniel's interest would continue, because she was simply being authentic and trusting that genuine compatibility would become apparent over time. Victoria noticed the change in Maya's demeanor during their next coffee date, recognizing the subtle signs of someone who is cautiously optimistic about a new connection. "Tell me about this Daniel person," Victoria said with a knowing smile. "You have the same expression I probably had when I first started spending time with David." Maya shared the story of meeting Daniel and their subsequent interactions, noting how different the experience felt from the dating anxieties she'd witnessed in others. Victoria listened with the kind of attentive interest that had become characteristic of their transformed relationship, asking thoughtful questions rather than offering unsolicited advice. "It sounds like you're approaching this exactly the way I learned to approach my relationship with David," Victoria observed, "from a place of curiosity rather than desperation, with attention to genuine compatibility rather than romantic fantasy." Maya appreciated her sister's recognition of the healthy dynamics she was cultivating with Daniel. Victoria's own growth had made her an insightful observer of relationship patterns, and her support meant more to Maya than external validation from friends who might not understand her careful approach to romantic connection. Over the winter months, Maya and Daniel developed a relationship that enhanced both their individual lives and their professional effectiveness. They attended educational conferences together, shared resources and ideas for their respective programs, and gradually increased the time they spent together outside of work-related activities. The progression felt natural and sustainable rather than driven by external pressure or artificial timelines. Maya maintained her existing routines and relationships while incorporating Daniel into aspects of her life where their interests aligned. He met her book club friends, joined her for hiking adventures that matched his fitness level, and even visited the animal shelter to learn about her volunteer work there. Most importantly, Daniel's presence in Maya's life enhanced rather than complicated her relationship with Victoria. He appreciated the sisterly bond that had become so important to both women, and he enjoyed spending time with Victoria and David when their social activities overlapped. "I love watching you with Daniel," Victoria confided during one of their regular coffee conversations in early spring. "You're completely yourself around him, the same way I learned to be with David. It's beautiful to see you experience the kind of partnership that celebrates who you already are, instead of trying to change you." Maya appreciated her sister's recognition of the growing happiness she had with Daniel. Their relationship had reached the point where they were discussing future possibilities with the same thoughtful consideration that had characterized Victoria and David's engagement process. Daniel had been offered an opportunity to lead a statewide education initiative that would require relocating to the capital city, and he'd asked Maya to consider moving with him if she could find a suitable teaching position in the new location. The conversation had been honest about both the opportunities and challenges such a move would present for each of them. "I don't want you to sacrifice your career or community connections for my opportunity, but I also want you to know that I appreciate our professional connection regardless of whether there's potential for anything more personal." Maya felt impressed by Daniel's straightforward approach, which honored both the possibility of romantic interest and the value of their connection independent of that outcome. This was exactly the kind of respectful, secure communication that she'd learned to recognize as a sign of emotional maturity. "I'd like to see you again, too," Maya replied honestly. "I'm enjoying getting to know you, and I appreciate your direct communication about your intentions." As Maya drove home that evening, she reflected on how different this felt from the dating experiences she'd observed in others, or the few romantic connections she'd pursued in previous years. There was no anxiety about whether she was presenting herself correctly or whether Daniel's interest would continue, because she was simply being authentic and trusting that genuine compatibility would become apparent over time. Victoria noticed the change in Maya's demeanor during their next coffee date, recognizing the subtle signs of someone who was cautiously optimistic about a new connection. "Tell me about this Daniel person," Victoria said with a knowing smile. "You have the same expression I probably had when I first started spending time with David." Maya shared the story of meeting Daniel and their subsequent interactions, noting how different the experience felt from the dating anxieties she'd witnessed in others. Victoria listened with the kind of attentive interest that had become characteristic of their transformed relationship, asking thoughtful questions rather than offering unsolicited advice. It sounds like you're approaching this exactly the way I learned to approach my relationship with David, Victoria observed, from a place of curiosity rather than desperation, with attention to genuine compatibility rather than romantic fantasy. Maya appreciated her sister's recognition of the healthy dynamics she was cultivating with Daniel. Victoria's own growth had made her an insightful observer of relationship patterns, and her support meant more to Maya than external validation from friends who might not understand her careful approach to romantic connection. Over the winter months, Maya and Daniel developed a relationship that enhanced both their individual lives and their professional effectiveness. They attended educational conferences together, shared resources and ideas for their respective programs, and gradually increased the time they spent together outside of work-related activities. The progression felt natural and sustainable rather than driven by external pressure or artificial timelines. Maya maintained her existing routines and relationships while incorporating Daniel into aspects of her life where their interests aligned. He met her book club friends, joined her for hiking adventures that matched his fitness level, and even visited the animal shelter to learn about her volunteer work there. Most importantly, Daniel's presence in Maya's life enhanced rather than complicated her relationship with Victoria. He appreciated the sisterly bond that had become so important to both women, and he enjoyed spending time with Victoria and David when their social activities overlapped. "I love watching you with Daniel," Victoria confided during one of their regular coffee conversations in early spring. "You're completely yourself around him, the same way I learned to be with David. It's beautiful to see you experience the kind of partnership that celebrates who you already are, instead of trying to change you." Maya appreciated her sister's recognition of her growing happiness with Daniel. Their relationship had reached the point where they were discussing future possibilities with the same thoughtful consideration that had characterized Victoria and David's engagement process. Daniel had been offered an opportunity to lead a statewide education initiative that would require relocating to the capital city, and he'd asked Maya to consider moving with him if she could find a suitable teaching position in the new location. The conversation had been honest about both the opportunities and challenges such a move would present for each of them. "I don't want you to sacrifice your career or community connections for my opportunity, but I also want you to know that I appreciate our professional connection regardless of whether there's potential for anything more personal." Maya felt impressed by Daniel's straightforward approach, which honored both the possibility of romantic interest and the value of their connection independent of that outcome. This was exactly the kind of respectful, secure communication that she'd learned to recognize as a sign of emotional maturity. "I'd like to see you again, too," Maya replied honestly. "I'm enjoying getting to know you."
Many guests commented on how Maya's example of living authentically had encouraged them to pursue their own passions more boldly or approach their relationships with greater honesty and self-respect. Maya has this gift for making people feel like their authentic selves are not only acceptable, but valuable, said Sarah, her teaching colleague who'd become one of her closest friends. "Being around her makes you want to be more honest about what really matters to you and less concerned about meeting others' expectations." Victoria gave the final toast of the evening, her words capturing the transformation in their relationship and the impact of Maya's example on her own journey toward authentic happiness. "3 years ago, I called my sister in desperation, asking for relationship advice because my marriage was falling apart," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered group. "I thought Maya was missing out on something essential because she was single and seemed content with her independent life. What I discovered was that Maya had actually figured out the secret to genuine happiness, building a rich, meaningful existence based on personal values and authentic connections." Victoria went on to explain how Maya's example had taught her that the most important relationship anyone could have was with themselves, and that all other connections should enhance rather than replace that foundation of self-knowledge and self-respect.
Maya showed me that there's no single formula for a fulfilling life, and that the courage to live according to your own values creates possibilities you never could have imagined. Victoria continued her willingness to wait for the right partnership, rather than settling for any partnership, led to finding Daniel, just as my willingness to learn from her wisdom led to finding David and, more importantly, finding myself. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, Maya felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the community she'd built and the love she'd cultivated in so many forms. Her relationship with Victoria had evolved from competition and misunderstanding to deep mutual respect and support. Her professional life had flourished through authentic engagement with students and colleagues. Her romantic partnership with Daniel represented the kind of mutual enhancement she'd always hoped was possible. The sister who had once pitied Maya's single status and insisted that marriage was the only path to happiness had become one of Maya's greatest champions and closest confidants. Victoria had learned that happiness came in many forms, and that the most important ingredient was authenticity rather than conformity to external expectations. As Maya prepared to leave Millbrook for her new adventure with Daniel, she reflected on the lesson that had emerged from Victoria's transformation and her own journey, that the quality of any life was determined not by its external circumstances, but by the integrity with which those circumstances were chosen and the love with which they were embraced. The role reversal was complete, but it had evolved into something more beautiful than either sister could have anticipated. They both learned that wisdom comes from living authentically, that happiness takes many forms, and that the most important relationship anyone can have is with themselves. Everything else, including the most beautiful partnerships, flows from that foundation of self-knowledge and self-respect. The morning of Maya's departure was filled with the bittersweet mixture of excitement and sadness that accompanies major life transitions. Victoria arrived early to help with final packing, bringing coffee and pastries from their favorite bakery for what would be their last morning routine in Millbrook for the foreseeable future. "I'm going to miss our weekly coffee dates," Victoria said as they sat among the packed boxes in Maya's nearly empty apartment. "But I'm so excited about this new chapter for you, and I know we'll find ways to maintain our connection even with the distance." Maya felt grateful for Victoria's support and confidence in their relationship's durability. The bond they'd built over the past 3 years was strong enough to survive geographic separation, and both sisters understood that their connection had become one of the most valuable relationships in their lives. Daniel arrived with the moving truck right on schedule, and the moving process proceeded smoothly with help from Victoria, David, and several friends who'd volunteered their time. As Maya's possessions were packed away and her apartment transformed back into an empty space ready for the next tenant, she felt the mixture of anticipation and nostalgia that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The last item to be packed was Victoria's ceramic bowl, the one she'd given Maya as a wedding gift with the inscription about building a life from the inside out. Maya wrapped it carefully in soft cloth, ensuring it would arrive safely in her new home, where it would continue to serve as a reminder of the wisdom they'd both gained through Victoria's transformation. As the moving truck pulled away and Maya prepared to follow in her car with Daniel, Victoria embraced her sister with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like, and for having the patience to love me even when I couldn't see past my own insecurities and misconceptions." Maya hugged her sister tightly, feeling grateful for the journey that had brought them to this point of mutual understanding and support. "Thank you for trusting me with your vulnerability and for being brave enough to change when change was needed. You taught me that wisdom can come at any age if we're willing to be honest about what isn't working." As Maya drove away from Millbrook with Daniel beside her, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had begun with Victoria's desperate text message asking for relationship advice. The sister who had once insisted that Maya's happiness was incomplete without romantic partnership had discovered her own capacity for joy and fulfillment in both independence and healthy love. The journey ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Maya felt confident that the lessons learned through Victoria's transformation would continue to guide both sisters toward authentic happiness in whatever forms it might take. They'd both learned that the most important relationship was with themselves,
and that all other connections should flow from that foundation of self-knowledge and self-respect. The role reversal was complete, but it had evolved into something more beautiful than either sister could have anticipated. They'd both learned that wisdom comes from living authentically, that happiness takes many forms, and that the most important relationship anyone can have is with themselves. Everything else, including the most beautiful partnerships, flows from that foundation of self-knowledge and self-respect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.